Welcome to Stricken Aberdeenshire, where we deal today with one of the great implications of the coronavirus crisis, the greatest health crisis for a century, an economic tsunami looming, but what is the effect on mental health of what humanity is enduring and these uniquely frightening circumstances? We turn to Emma Kenny, the television psychologist, probably Britain's best known psychologist, who tells us how to cope with coronavirus. And then to Dr. Lisa Cameron MP, who leads a cross-party group of members of Parliament and members of the House of Lords who are pressing the government for particular action to support the mental health of those in the front line of tackling COVID-19. But first, it has been in Glasgow. Your tweets, your emails and your messages.
Thank you, Alex. And first we hear from Jim Spence, who says, I probably caught it halfway through channel hopping, but still, Dr. Chris Smith, virologist at Cambridge Uni there on the Alex Salmond Show, making more sense than anything I've heard so far on COVID-19. Sensible questioning and calm explanations. Lynn Finlayson says, very informative show. I really liked Professor Hugh Montgomery's comments about recognising that the planet is vulnerable and the world needs to rethink how it behaves. Kevin says, good to hear from scientists giving us a frank and honest insight into COVID-19. Keep up the good work. Hamilton Collins says, so proud of our Scottish SNP government. Eve Earley says, we're not in real lockdown when we allow people to fly in and out of the UK with no checks. Tam says, in a world pandemic, money shouldn't matter compared to people's health. Spend the money and save lives. Don't worry about the cost. Kathleen says, an important programme, Alex. Tragic circumstances. Stay safe with kind regards from Norway. Andrew says, we will have experts once this is over. No expert exists on new viruses. It is disingenuous for anyone to classify themselves as this. The frontline doctor is the best expert since he or she will be following the progress of this condition firsthand. Charmaine says, we have to have a very controlled strategy for it. The virus is on the island and we can't be in lockdown until a vaccine. And finally, on a lighter note, Mary White says, hello Alex, I've never seen your hair longer. This will be renamed the lockdown style. Stay safe.
Not only are we all living through the uniquely frightening circumstances of the greatest health crisis for 100 years, but right now, 1/3 of the population of this planet, more than 2,000 million people, are experiencing some sort of lockdown or restriction in social interaction. I've turned to Emma Kenny, probably Britain's best known behavioural psychologist because of her work in morning television, to tell me what advice can be given to people suffering from these unique circumstances. Emma, welcome to the Alex Salmond Show.
Thanks for having me.
Now, Emma Kenny, we're now in this extraordinary situation where 1/3 of the planet, more than 2 billion people worldwide, are engaged in some sort of clampdown, some sort of lockdown of society as governments struggle to cope with the pandemic. What does that do, this social isolation? What particular issues does that throw up in terms of mental health?
I hear quite a lot of people saying, well, the difference between being socially isolated and being somebody who then presents with mental health issues, for example, suicidality, the difference is that you can't catch that. Well, actually, you can. So WHO globally reports that if you are a victim of somebody who around you has taken their own life, you become unprecedentedly higher to the chance of taking your own life. So actually, things like suicidality is catching, whether we want to talk about that or otherwise. And social isolation is absolutely a precursor of that type of behaviour. So the idea that people are just managing their mental health whilst completely isolated, feeling stripped of their freedom, and on top of that, not having access to services that they should be having access to, which are already overstretched and not very helpful in the most part to the general population because there just isn't the capacity. We absolutely are facing a global disaster as far as mental health is concerned. I am not necessarily concerned right now. I am hugely concerned about the next 12 months when trauma hits. And it's not just about the mental health of individuals who are dealing with those kind of frontline mental health issues. It's those who are the victims of individuals who are also domestically abusive, which affect mental health. And that's all around the world. I think we're in for a really catastrophic experience in the future.
And some of the issues which have been thrown up in this crisis, the stories about the elderly not being admitted to hospital, the controversy about herd immunity in the outset at least of this crisis in the United Kingdom, would these add to the difficulties by making older people feel that they're regarded as somehow expendable in terms of official policy?
I think that to be made to feel that you are expendable is a terrifying experience for anybody. And don't get me wrong, I think it's so important that we have a pragmatism and an acceptance of death. I really do. But I don't think that we should have a situation where one life seems much more important than another, because that would be detrimental to the whole argument of meaning.
Now let's look at the opposite of isolation, the family pressures of lockdown. I mean, you're a mother of two teenage lads. Is there any advice you can give to people how you tolerate proximity as opposed to isolation?
One of the most important pieces of advice for any parent is I would never lie to you, because I'm a useless teacher, and I can guarantee that the reason I never trained to be one is because I can't teach my own children. I appreciate that fully. So first of all, I think that your small wins are important. This time, if you're like me and you're not the most able to educate your teenage boys or your young children, take the pressure off you. If you can create intimacy and bonding, if you can give yourself space and time to just really provide the experience that you're having with a situation where there's not a lot of pressure on the education, but there's a lot of hope and opportunity for you to kind of connect to the family, do fun things, that would be my number one tip. Secondly, cabin fever is completely normal. It would be really strange for you to surround yourself by the same people day in, day out, constantly 24/7 without feeling a bit annoyed at times. But the most important thing to remember is when you feel frustrated and angry, often it's because you want to externalize a difficult feeling you're experiencing. So instead of projecting that and externalizing it, just take a step back, because the reality is that every single emotion we have is a prompt. So if you feel frustrated, you're not actually being told to go and have a go at one of your children. You're being told to go and calm down, take some space out. If you're feeling scared, you're being taught to go and do something that gives you courage, and so on and so forth. So I think for people living in their own homes with children, sometimes in one room, that's another thing. You know, the economic divide in the UK is substantial. So know that it's understandable to have these difficult feelings. Know it's understandable at times to feel that you're not doing the best job with your kids regarding education. Accept that that's perfectly all right, and recognise that in the end, other people will take over, will return to normal, reframe that this is momentary, and just connect with the things that give you the most contentment, which in my case is just spending a lot of nice time with my kids, not doing their maths homework with them.
Let's look at on the darker side of family relationships. It's clear at the outset of the lockdown that the authorities, the police, were very worried about an upsurge in domestic violence and abuse. Were they right to be concerned, and is that the way that things are playing out?
Majorly right to be concerned, and majorly right to understand that this is how it's going to play out. Absolutely. We know that homicides are up, we know that domestic abuse is up, and it's just completely commonsensical. You know, it doesn't matter how much training you have or no training. The point is that you know that if you take a situation where people are looked up with abusive individuals and you don't necessarily have access to the same services that you would have, or you're maybe afraid that even if you are in danger in your home, you might also be in danger if you leave it, that paradigm in itself is a juxtaposition. You know, I'm in danger out there, I'm in danger in here. This is the place I know. So therefore you're at risk, your children are at risk. I absolutely am terrified. It keeps me up at night, this. I'm terrified about the children who are being abused in their own homes. You know, they don't have voices most of the time, but what changes their voice is the teacher who notices, and it's often the teacher or the friend in the playground who they tell, or the person that they confide in dinner hour. They're the people who make a difference to those children's lives. And right now, those kids are locked up with predators in their own home with no voice. Childline have gone through the roof in children ringing, and that's only the kids brave enough to pick up the phone. And we know for a fact, because we're seeing the statistics regarding abuse situations and police call-outs. So this is a real problem. And like I said, my big fear is not necessarily right now in the eye of the storm. It's what's going to play out in the next 6 to 12 months when we find out just how catastrophic this was to those kind of individuals. I mean, personally, I've had 4 suicides in the past, month and a half. That's just been completely out of my experience for such a long time. I've never had such a consolidated amount of loss. And I imagine that's going to be the same with murders, and it's certainly the same with domestic abuse.
Emma Kenny, some of the most difficult stories that we've heard, individual stories, during this crisis have been people explaining how difficult it has been not to be able to say a proper goodbye or farewell to the loved ones. That must be an extraordinary and almost unprecedented situation in terms of the pressure that puts on people. Can you give us an insight on how families and individuals can handle such an experience?
I think that one of the most important parts of losing someone is ritual. And I think that whilst ritual in the UK might just mean, you know, we spend a little bit of time with our loved one after the event, we might go and visit them at a funeral home, or if we're more modern, we might keep them at home. We know in places like Ireland, that's what happens. And when you think about the actual funeral, you connect with lots of people who come and share stories, and you kind of have this momentary experience where even though it's tragic and awful, you can just allow yourself to have that mutual community grieving, and it's powerful. It's really powerful. The fact that that's not going to happen, the fact that only a few of you might be able to even go to the funeral, and in that case be socially distancing, meaning that you don't have the intimacy and connection of the people that you love around you. I can't imagine how catastrophic that is. Certainly, having gone through my own father's death and having a big funeral and dealing with all of those experiences, you know, in quite a linear perspective, it's still incredibly difficult to manage. So to see people now saying goodbye to children at times, you know, children with life-limiting issues that have then died, and not being able to have that time with them, I cannot imagine how that will add to the trauma. I can't envisage how anybody will avoid it being traumatizing. So I think that not to almost explore the impact versus mental and physical is something that I think we've got it wrong. If I'm really honest, Alex, if I'm really honest, we've got it wrong, is what I think.
It's not the case that people trying to face some of the immediate practical effects also have severe problems of stress. I mean, food for the family, loss of income, loss of job, loss of business, children's prospects. Are they going to be able to suffer because of their examinations and not being able to have the normal teaching? Are these not the serious individual practical pressures that perhaps much of the official guidance is missing? Aren't these the things that bear down on working families?
The most deprived communities, the most disenfranchised individuals within those because of their opportunities, they are the ones that are already suffering desperately in our communities. They've already been suffering. You know, it's been my life's work to try to highlight and work in those communities. To imagine that adding this layer isn't going to be even more problematic for them would be really short-sighted. And I do think at the moment that the reason that people aren't allowing themselves to think about that future is because it does feel really scary. And it comes back down to the only time that we can really help people is when we manage their mental health and wellness. And that comes down to meeting their hierarchy of needs.
You've warned us in this interview that there could be a mental health tidal wave in the aftermath of this health crisis. Other than some things that we might be able to cling on to make society better in the aftermath of this terrible epidemic?
For years and years and years, psychologists, therapists, all of the people who work in mental wellness and charities have said there is a very simple rule to happiness that the Western philosophy denies. It takes you away. It says, buy this and you'll be happy, buy that and you'll be happy. And we've been telling you forever, listen, look after your physical health. Look after your nutritional health, look after your mental health, surround yourself with people who love you and get you, and don't worry about people that don't know you and don't care for you. Spend time doing things that you're passionate for, and also remember that whilst you're breathing and you're dealing with the wonder of this world, you are rich beyond measure. Stop buying in to the capitalist myth. That makes you unhappy. Follow your own dreams and stick with the people who follow them with you. That is the recipe. So if you want to know why you've been happy during this pandemic, mostly it's because you've spoken to your neighbours, you spent time missing the people that you love, you've been joyed about the fact that there's so many community measures that are taking place, and you felt part of something bigger than you. Take that recipe and make it the rest of your life, because that is your answer.
Emma Kenny from Manchester, thank you very much indeed.
Take care.
Join us after the break, where we'll focus attention on the particular mental pressures being suffered by those in the front line in the caring professions, the emergency services, as they struggle to cope with the coronavirus crisis. Welcome back. Now we're going to look at the psychological impact of combating this virus by the people on the front line, those in the health service, the caring services. Lisa Cameron is the Member of Parliament for East Kilbride, Straven and Lesmahago. She joins me from South Lanarkshire. Lisa Cameron, welcome back to the Alex Salmond Show.
Thank you very much.
Now, you've been leading a cross-party group of some 70 parliamentarians, members of Parliament from Westminster, members of the House of Lords, who've been pressing the government very hard on taking initiatives to look hard at the psychological impact on those in the front line. What's your aim and intention behind this initiative?
It's really, really important that we treat mental health and physical health with parity, because what we know is that staff who are on the front line are going to be experiencing high levels of trauma. We have staff who are losing colleagues. We have staff who are coping with a high number of bereavements in workplaces where they may have been caring for people for many years, and those people are sadly dying due to this pandemic. We also have very new staff who have come off of training courses and are on the front line who want to do their bit. But we know that they're going to be exposed to high levels of trauma, burnout, very intense and long hours, and treating high levels of morbidity. And therefore, it's only right that we look after their mental well-being at this time alongside that of their physical health.
Now, in a former life, before you were elected as a Member of Parliament, you were a clinical psychologist in the National Health Service. So you must have a substantial insight into the particular pressures of those in the front line.
Well, it's true to say that I've worked for a long time in my career as a psychologist, and mental health has been at the forefront of my career prior to coming into Parliament. It's something that we must do very much more in relation to supporting the general public in terms of awareness and seeking help. And it's also something that we must protect staff, particularly at times of crisis. And we know that the World Health Organization have recommended psychological first aid in times when we have crises to deal with, and staff are on the front line. So we're pressing the government that really the response has to include telephone hotlines, it has to include psychological first aid to try to prevent post-traumatic stress disorder developing in those staff on the front line wherever possible. And it also has to involve a longer-term plan for psychological interventions for those who need more intense support towards the latter stages and in following waves of the coronavirus as that develops over time.
Dr. Cameron, can we look at some of the particular aspects of this? It's said and reported, and we're all grateful for it, that the National Health Service has not been overwhelmed in terms of this vicious virus. But nonetheless, there are huge pressures on staff members. Can you give us an insight into what these are?
We know that the working time regulations for doctors have now been relaxed, and therefore they're working extremely long hours, way beyond often the working time regulations that we would recommend for people's safety and well-being. They want to be doing extra at this time. They want to be ensuring that patients have care, but we have to be really cognizant of the impact upon them, their mental well-being and physical health, but also that of their family lives. The overall impact, basically they're putting their lives on hold, risking themselves and their families. There's a huge amount of anxiety regarding having adequate protections in terms of personal protective equipment for doctors and for all staff at the front line, nurses, care workers, etc. So when you combine all of those factors, in addition to the trauma that they're going to be exposed to in such high levels at this point in time, we know that we have to do a lot to support them in terms of their well-being, and that we must take a holistic approach to that, including mental well-being, or else we're going to have a tsunami of mental health issues after this pandemic finishes.
As we know, the virus, COVID-19, can be fatal for anybody of any age, but there has been a particular pressure on older people, not just those in care homes, but people in terms of the social isolation of not being able to see friends and family and grandchildren. What is the substantial psychological impact on our elderly population? And will many of these people believe that they're being left behind in terms of the government policy?
Absolutely. In fact, the all-party parliamentary group for disability that I chair, we're writing to government this week, and we have a meeting with the Disabilities Minister about those very issues. People are feeling that they have been cut off from their support networks, and that's extremely important for older adults who perhaps depend upon the care system. We need to be making sure that those who are most vulnerable in our society are receiving the adequate support at this point in time that they need in order to cope with what is a massive change to lifestyles. It's, in addition to anxiety, not going to be unexpected that many people will develop symptoms of depression as they feel more isolated and cut off from their natural day-to-day supports that are very protective factors against mental health problems.
Now, what response have you had, your parliamentary, cross-party parliamentary group, from ministers? I know you've said you have a meeting coming up this week, but has there been any indications from government that they're able to take on board the points you're making about particular psychological pressure on the caring professions?
Yes, very much so. I understand from the Special Advisory Group meetings that they have been looking at this in more detail now. There's a hotline that is available for staff to contact. We've very much recommended that that's extended from NHS staff to all staff on the front line so that no one is left behind, and we're supporting everyone where we need to be doing so. But what we need to be doing is taking it forward in terms of government support for psychological first aid as recommended by the World Health Organization to prevent post-traumatic stress disorder wherever possible.
Now, Lisa Cameron, we know that some countries thus far have managed to handle the pandemic much better than others. Are there any examples of international best practice for those looking at the psychological impact on the caring professions? You'll have studied the WHO literature and the practice of other countries. Where do you see inspiration coming from that we should follow in terms of getting the best outcomes for those in the front line?
We know that with SARS and with the other types of pandemic that have impacted other countries, that the psychological crises for people come in waves, that it doesn't come all at the one point in time. So it's important that we have this long-term delivery plan, and that's what's needed in terms of supporting mental well-being for staff, not just at the occupational health level in the NHS, etc., but for those in care homes, for those right across the front line who need access to that, but they also are going to need access over a longer period of time with stepped up care, where people can have interventions at the level that they require and at the timing that they require in order to best meet their mental health needs. So it's going to be very much a staged and long-term impact. It's very much a marathon in terms of mental health rather than a sprint. And I think the government's starting to take that on board in the Special Advisory Group, and provisions are being put in place at the current time, and those issues are being looked at now in detail to make sure that best practice is developed across the UK. They've been there for us, and we only have to do our bit for them. It's only right, otherwise it's a real detriment to society if we were to let people down who have put themselves on the line for us at this important point in time.
Lisa Cameron, as a clinical psychologist and a member of Parliament, thinking about your personal experiences as this crisis has unfolded, is there anything which has made you say, right, something has to be done, particularly in terms of the psychological aspects of this pandemic? And equally, is there some story from your own constituency, perhaps, which has been an example so inspiring? You've said, yes, this is exactly the sort of thing that communities should be doing to respond to this crisis.
Well, as a Member of Parliament, I really want to be using all of the knowledge, understanding and expertise that I've gained throughout my career in psychology to try to make sure that best practice is rolled out right across the United Kingdom and that staff and services are protected, and also the general public has the supports in place that they need. And I think as parliamentarians, it's been inspirational to see doctors and nurses who are MPs going back to the front line to do their bit, and I'm very much planning to do the same as the mental health resources and supports are rolled out too.
Dr. Lisa Cameron from South Lanarkshire, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Every one of us is living through extraordinary times. More than 1/3 of the entire population of this planet have already been in some form of lockdown as governments across the world have struggled to cope with the COVID pandemic. Despite these draconian measures, over 3 million people have already contracted the virus and around 250,000 are already dead. Both of these figures are likely to be substantial underestimates, and we're only at the beginning of this virus's deadly toll. It should be said there are some glimmers of hope. There are countries, large and small, east and west, developed and underdeveloped, those who have followed the World Health Organization advice on contact tracing, who have thus far managed to hold this virus at bay. Others have been much less successful. As the World Health Organization have informed us, the epicenter of coronavirus is currently not in the east where it started, but in Europe and North America. This could change over time. It may yet be that Africa and South America will be ravaged by coronavirus and feel the full impact of its deadly toll. However, no country, however successful in tackling the pandemic itself, can be insulated from the economic whirlwind which will surely follow, and the psychological problems which we have discussed today, which have been described as a tsunami which will surely come in the aftermath of the pandemic. These psychological effects are both short-term and long-term. They are likely to be massive. However, never underestimate the most precious commodity of all, the power of the human spirit. In the end, it's hope that keeps us all alive. And now from Tasmina and myself and all the crew, it's goodbye for now, stay safe, and we'll see you next week.